For 10 years I didn't touch a woman. Then 3 Apache women surrendered in my cabin. For 10 long years, Jack had lived alone in the quiet wilderness, far from towns, roads, and the clamor of people. The forest had become his world, the trees his companions, and the wind his constant messenger. It was not that he hated people, or that he had lost faith in humanity, but life had taught him lessons he could never forget. Betrayal, disappointment, and heartbreak had slowly driven him to seek refuge in solitude.
He had made a choice, a silent vow to himself, that he would not allow anyone to touch his life in ways that could hurt him again, especially women, whose presence had once stirred emotions too strong, too painful, and too complicated to face.
Past. Jack's cabin was small but sturdy, built from timber he had cut himself and carefully assembled with patient hands. It sat on the edge of a forest clearing, overlooking a stream that whispered its way over smooth stones, carrying the scent of pine and fresh water. Breath. He had chosen this place not just for isolation, but for the sense of peace it offered. A space where he could breathe freely and think clearly without the noise of the outside world pressing down on him. Each morning he woke to the sound of bird song and the soft rustle of leaves, and each night he fell asleep to the distant hoot of an owl and the crackle of the fireplace that warmed his simple home. Life in the wilderness was not easy. Jack had to work every day to survive. He hunted for his meals, setting traps carefully along trails he knew like the back of his hand. He fished in the stream for trout, learning the patience that rivers demand. He chopped wood, carried water, and tended to a small vegetable patch that supplied him with basic nourishment. Every task was repetitive, yet in repetition he found comfort. The physical labor kept him grounded, his mind focused, and his spirit at peace. There was a rhythm to this life that city living could never offer. The rhythm of the seasons, the rhythm of the day and night, and the rhythm of his own heartbeat in sync with the wilderness. Despite the harshness of solitude, Jack had grown to understand the forest in a way few people ever could. He knew which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. He could track animals by the slightest footprints, the faintest disturbance in the soil, or the broken twig along a hidden path. He could predict the weather by the smell of the air and the movement of clouds, but the forest spoke to him in a language of subtle signs and quiet messages. And he had learned to listen. In many ways, the wilderness had become a teacher, and Jack, its devoted student. Yet, there was a loneliness that gnawed at him, one that even the beauty of nature could not fully chase away. There were nights when he stared at the fire, thinking of the life he had left behind, the friends he had drifted from, the laughter that no longer filled his days, and the warmth of human touch that he had not felt in 10 years. Memories of the past would rise like ghosts, both comforting and painful, reminding him of what he had chosen to give up. He did not mourn these memories constantly, but they were always there, quietly shaping his thoughts like shadows cast by the trees outside his cabin. Jack's life had become a delicate balance between solitude and survival. He was cautious, wary of anything that might disrupt the fragile peace he had built. Travelers occasionally passed near his cabin, curious about the lone figure in the woods, but Jack had long ago learned how to remain unseen when he wished. He respected others' paths and expected the same respect in return. He had learned to appreciate distance and boundaries, understanding that while he could live without company, the forest itself offered companionship in its own subtle ways. The soft rustle of leaves, the playful dart of a squirrel, or the sudden flight of a bird startled by his presence. Evenings were the most reflective time for Jack. He would sit by his fireplace, the warm glow dancing on the wooden walls of his cabin, and think about the life he had led and the life he had left behind. He thought of people he had loved and lost, of mistakes that had cost him dearly, and of the promises he had made to himself. He never blamed anyone fully. He understood that life often moves in unpredictable ways, and people do what they must to survive. His isolation was not bitterness, it was protection, a careful sheltering of his heart from potential pain. He had become a master of solitude, and in that mastery he found strength, patience, and clarity. Jack had also cultivated a simple routine that kept his mind sharp and his body strong. Every morning he would walk along the stream, observing nature in its quiet magnificence. He would note the tracks of deer, the movements of foxes, and the subtle changes in the plants as the seasons shifted. He kept a small journal, writing down his observations and reflections, not for anyone else, but for himself, a record of a life lived close to the earth and deeply aware of its lessons. Each day was a small triumph, a confirmation that he could live independently and fully, even without the companionship of others. But even in his perfect routine, Jack sometimes felt the tug of human connection. It was not a desire he sought to act on, but a gentle reminder that he was human, that he had once been part of the world of people, and that he was not immune to the need for trust and care. He would occasionally hear the distant laughter of children from a far-off homestead, or the sound of voices carried on the wind, and a strange mix of longing and contentment would fill him. He had learned to live with these feelings, to acknowledge them without acting on them, and to understand that life had a rhythm that sometimes included solitude and sometimes included others. Jack's story was not one of bitterness or regret. It was a story of deliberate choice, of the conscious decision to live a life stripped to its essentials, guided by the rhythms of nature and the strength of self-reliance. He was not lonely in the conventional sense. He was simply alone. And in that aloneness, he found a clarity and peace that most people never experience. His cabin was not just a home. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could reflect on life, confront his fears, and nurture his independence. Yet beneath the calm surface of Jack's life there was a quiet tension. 10 years of avoiding human contact had built walls that even he sometimes feared were too high. He had convinced himself that his solitude was enough, but deep down, he knew that life was unpredictable. The forest had taught him patience, observation, and survival, but it had not fully prepared him for the moment when the outside world might reach him again in ways he could not ignore. Little did he know that moment was approaching, an event that would challenge every belief he held about solitude, trust, and the human heart. As night fell over the forest, Jack sat by the fireplace, listening to the whispering wind and watching the shadows dance across the wooden walls. He felt the familiar comfort of his routine, the quiet satisfaction of survival, and the steady heartbeat of life flowing through the forest. For 10 years he had lived without the touch of another human being, especially a woman. And for 10 years he had felt safe, secure, and in control. But the world, as it often does, was about to remind him that life rarely stays confined to one path for long. The solitude he had cherished so deeply was about to be interrupted in a way he could never have predicted. Jack closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of burning wood and the cool air drifting through the cabin. The wilderness had been his friend, his teacher, and his shield, but even as he embraced the peace he had carved out for himself, the first whispers of change were beginning to stir, carried on the wind through the trees, unseen but inevitable. For 10 years, Jack had not touched a woman, had not let another human into his life in any meaningful way. And yet something in the night was about to challenge the very foundation of his solitude, forcing him to confront the world he had left behind and the human connections he had tried so carefully to avoid. The next evening, as the sun dipped behind the thick trees and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jack was sitting by his fireplace cleaning the fish he had caught earlier in the day. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of rain, and the forest seemed unusually restless. Birds flitted nervously from branch to branch, and the stream gurgled louder than usual, as if warning of a storm to come. Jack noticed it but paid little attention, trusting in the skills and experience he had gained over the years. He had seen storms like this before, and he knew they would pass. Then came the sound. A series of knocks, quick and urgent, at his cabin door. Jack froze, knife in hand, heart tightening ever so slightly. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was outside, seeking shelter or help.
For 10 years, he had avoided this exact situation, preferring the silence of his own company to the unpredictability of strangers.
Yet there was something different about these knocks. They carried urgency, fear, and desperation that stirred a long-forgotten instinct in him. He hesitated, listening carefully as the wind howled around the cabin and rain began to patter lightly against the roof. Jack set down the knife and slowly approached the door, peering through the small window. His eyes widened slightly as he saw 3 women, drenched from the rain, huddled together, shivering and soaked. They were clearly exhausted, mud streaked across their clothing, hair plastered to their faces. Their expressions were a mixture of fear, determination, and hope. They were not wanderers, he realized. They were running from something. The way they clung to each other suggested danger, yet their eyes carried a silent plea for safety. Jack's first instinct was caution. He had built walls around his life, and they were not easy to dismantle. But instinctively he also knew he could not leave them out in the storm. The forest could be unforgiving, and the rain was only intensifying. He took a deep breath, feeling the old conflict between solitude and humanity stir within him. Slowly, deliberately, he unlocked the door. "Come in," he said, his voice calm but firm. The women hesitated for a moment, unsure if this stranger could be trusted, before stepping into the warmth of the cabin. The sudden contrast between the cold, wet forest and the cozy interior seemed to lift some of their tension. They shivered, dripping water onto the wooden floor, and Jack instinctively grabbed towels, offering them to each woman. Breaths. Their hands were cold, and as they took the towels, Jack caught the briefest glimpse of relief in their eyes, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude and trust, fragile and new. Once they were somewhat warmed and dried, Jack gestured to the small chairs around the fire. They sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the storm rage outside. The crackling fire was almost hypnotic, a stark contrast to the pounding rain and howling wind. Jack kept his eyes on them, noticing small details, the way one woman's hands trembled slightly, the tension in another's shoulders, the quiet strength in the third's gaze. These were not women who had given up. They were survivors, weary but determined, carrying stories that had brought them to his doorstep. Finally, one of them spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Please, we need shelter. We don't have anywhere else to go." "Ah." Jack nodded slowly. He did not ask for explanations, did not demand proof or justification. There was no time for judgment, and the storm outside was reason enough to offer protection. Yet, even as he allowed them into his cabin, he felt the familiar caution tighten in his chest. He had not let anyone, especially a woman, into his life for 10 years. The very idea of closeness was foreign and uncomfortable, yet necessary in this moment. He led them to the small kitchen area and began preparing a simple meal. He boiled water for tea and warmed some of the food he had stored for emergencies. The aroma of hot food filled the cabin, mingling with the scent of wet wood and the faint tang of the rain-soaked forest. The women ate slowly, their hunger evident, and Jack watched them carefully, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring their comfort. It was a delicate balance, offering care without overstepping the boundaries that had kept him safe for so long. As they ate, the women began to speak, cautiously at first. They did not share everything, not yet, but small fragments of their journey slipped out. One spoke of a village far to the south, of life that had been disrupted by unforeseen circumstances. Another mentioned a long trek through the forest, of rivers crossed and mountains climbed, of nights spent hiding under trees and sleeping in cold, damp earth. The third, quietest of all, offered only brief observations about the forest, showing a knowledge of survival that matched Jack's own. He listened carefully, saying little, yet absorbing every word. Jack could sense the trust slowly building, fragile and tentative, like the first shoots of spring pushing through frozen soil. He understood that they were not just seeking shelter from the storm. They were seeking safety, understanding, and perhaps even a moment of peace. But though he had lived a decade without opening his home to strangers, something inside him softened. He realized that offering help did not mean surrendering his independence. It was a reminder of the humanity he had never lost, despite the walls he had built. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of letting up.
Jack fetched blankets and placed them on the floor for the women to rest.
He brought water in small cups and tended to their basic needs, all the while keeping a careful watch. The tension in the room eased gradually, replaced by the quiet hum of the fire and the rhythmic tapping of rain on the roof. In these hours, a silent understanding formed between them. He would protect them, they would respect his space, and together they would endure the storm. At one point, the women began to share more personal stories. They spoke of family, of losses and victories, of dreams deferred and hopes still alive. Jack, who had carefully avoided intimacy for 10 years, found himself drawn into their narratives. He did not offer much of his own story, not yet, but he listened with a patience and empathy that surprised even him. Their presence stirred emotions he had long suppressed, compassion, curiosity, and a quiet longing for connection that he had convinced himself he no longer needed. As night deepened, Jack could see the exhaustion in their eyes. One by one, they leaned back against the walls or curled up on the blankets, finally allowing themselves to rest. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin there was warmth, safety, and a sense of fragile peace. Jack sat by the fire, watching over them, reflecting on how unpredictable life could be. He had chosen solitude, had built walls to protect his heart, and yet, here were 3 women bringing the outside world into his carefully constructed life. And somehow he understood that this was not an intrusion but an opportunity, a chance to reconnect with a part of himself he had thought lost. The hours passed slowly, measured by the rhythm of the storm and the occasional crack of thunder. Jack remained alert, though his heart was no longer tense. There was a strange comfort in their presence, a reminder that life could surprise even the most cautious soul. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin window, the storm had softened to a gentle drizzle, and the forest seemed to breathe with relief. Jack looked at the 3 women, asleep and safe, and realized that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. In that quiet morning light, he allowed himself a rare thought. Perhaps solitude had been necessary for 10 years, but it did not have to be permanent. Perhaps human connection, even after long absence, could be approached with care, respect, and patience. Perhaps the walls he had built were not prisons, but choices, and choices could always be adjusted when life demanded. Jack rose quietly, tending to the fire, and preparing breakfast, mindful of their comfort and dignity. The women began to stir, yawning and stretching, their expressions softening as they realized they were still safe. There was no awkwardness, no fear of judgment, only a mutual acknowledgement of what had passed through the night. And in that moment, Jack understood that the world outside his cabin, with all its unpredictability and complexity, could coexist with the peace he had found in isolation. For the first time in 10 years, Jack felt the stirring of something he had not felt in a long while. Trust. Not blind trust, but cautious, measured trust. The kind that allowed humans to share space, warmth, and stories without fear. And though he did not yet know what the next days would bring, he felt ready, in some small way, to face them. The storm had not only brought 3 women to his cabin, it had brought him back to life, reminding him that even after a decade of solitude, the human heart could still be opened, slowly, carefully, and safely. The morning after the storm, the forest was quiet, drenched in a soft silver light from the mist rising off the trees and stream. The heavy rains had washed the air clean, leaving the scent of pine and wet earth filling Jack's cabin. The three women, still recovering from their long journey and the night in the storm, moved quietly around the small space, tidying what little they could and stretching their stiff limbs. Jack observed them from across the cabin, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease. He had spent 10 years alone avoiding the complexities of human relationships, and yet here they were, alive, present, and slowly becoming part of his world.
Jack had long ago learned patience in solitude, and that patience became his guide now.
He did not rush them or demand explanations. Instead, he offered small gestures of kindness, a cup of warm tea, a plate of cooked fish, a blanket for extra comfort. The women accepted without complaint, though their eyes sometimes flicked at him with cautious curiosity, as if measuring the boundaries of the man who had let them into his life. Jack noticed every glance, every small movement. He could see the careful dance of trust being formed, fragile and delicate, and he understood that the smallest gesture mattered more than any words. Once they had eaten and regained a little warmth, one of the women, the eldest of the three, finally spoke more openly. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced hardships yet remained steadfast. She began to recount fragments of her journey, not in a single flow, but piece by piece, each story carefully measured. Breaths. She spoke of leaving her village behind, of threats and challenges that had forced them to flee, of nights spent in fear and uncertainty, and of the strength that had kept them moving forward. Jack listened in silence, absorbing every word, sensing the weight of her experiences and the courage it took to survive. The second woman, younger and more expressive, chimed in with her own stories, painting vivid images of their journey through dense forests, rivers, and hills. She spoke of their determination, their resourcefulness, and the deep bond they shared as they relied on one another to overcome obstacles. Her voice carried both fatigue and hope, a mixture that resonated with Jack in unexpected ways. He had long avoided human connections, but listening to their words, he felt a stirring of empathy, an acknowledgement that pain and courage often traveled together. The third woman, the quietest of the group, had observed Jack closely since they entered the cabin. She did not speak much at first, but when she did, her words were thoughtful and precise, revealing a keen awareness of the natural world and a deep respect for survival. She noted the care Jack had taken in building his cabin, the skill in his hunting and fishing, and the discipline evident in his daily routines. Her observations were not intrusive. They were respectful, almost reverent. Jack, who had grown accustomed to silence and solitude, found himself appreciating her insight, feeling a connection that transcended words. As the morning passed into afternoon, the conversation in the cabin grew more open. Jack, who had rarely shared his past with anyone, began to reveal small details about his life, how he had come to live in the forest, the challenges of surviving alone, the lessons he had learned from nature, and the reasons for his long isolation. He spoke slowly, carefully, choosing each word as if testing the waters. The women listened attentively, asking gentle questions, never prying, and in that respectful space, Jack felt something he had not felt in years. A sense of being understood without judgment. The more they shared, the more Jack realized that this was not just a meeting of strangers. It was a collision of lives, each carrying its own history, pain, and resilience. The women were not helpless. They were survivors, just as he was. Their surrender to the cabin's shelter was not weakness, but a conscious choice, an acknowledgement that safety sometimes required trust. And Jack, for the first time in a decade, felt the delicate balance of giving and receiving that human relationships demanded. It was unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable, but also profoundly rewarding. By mid-afternoon, Jack suggested they step outside, despite the dampness of the forest floor. He wanted them to stretch their legs, to breathe the fresh post-storm air, and perhaps to see that the world beyond the cabin could be beautiful even after hardship. They followed cautiously, the eldest leading the way, and together they moved through the misty forest, stepping over fallen branches and muddy paths. The women's presence brought a new energy to the forest, a lively contrast to Jack's usual solitary rhythm. He noticed the subtle ways they observed the environment, the way one crouched to examine a plant, another paused to listen to distant bird calls, and the third scanned the horizon with careful attention. During this walk, the conversation continued, becoming lighter, even playful at times. They laughed quietly at small mishaps, exchanged observations about the forest, and shared moments of genuine joy. Jack felt a warmth spreading through him that he had not experienced in years. A reminder that human presence, when respectful and honest, could be comforting rather than threatening. He realized that trust, once built carefully and slowly, could open doors that solitude had long kept closed. As the afternoon sun began to filter through the mist, Jack led them back to the cabin. He had prepared a small meal in advance, knowing that after their long journey and the storm, nourishment was essential. They ate together in silence at first, savoring the food and the simple pleasure of warmth and sustenance. Then, slowly, conversation returned, this time centered on their hopes for the future. They spoke of returning to their families, rebuilding what had been lost, and finding stability after the turmoil they had endured. Jack listened, offering practical advice when appropriate, yet allowing them to lead the conversation. The women's trust in Jack was growing, and with it, a subtle shift in his own heart. He noticed the way they moved through the cabin, how they respected his space while still seeking comfort and companionship. There was no pressure, no intrusion, only the quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. Jack felt a sense of responsibility he had not anticipated, a desire to protect them, guide them, and ensure their safety. It was a new role, one that required patience, empathy, and careful judgment. Evening came, and the forest outside darkened once more. Jack built a fire in the hearth, the flames casting long shadows on the cabin walls. The women gathered close, wrapped in blankets, and the conversation turned reflective. They spoke of their fears, their regrets, and their dreams. Jack contributed where he felt comfortable, sharing his own lessons learned in solitude. The value of patience, the strength found in self-reliance, and the importance of observing the world with care. The women listened intently, occasionally nodding or offering a word of understanding. In this space, a quiet bond was forming, built on respect, shared stories, and the recognition of resilience in one another. Night deepened, and one by one the women began to rest. Jack stayed awake a little longer, tending the fire and reflecting on the day's events. He realized that the storm had been a turning point, not just for the women, but for himself. 10 years of solitude had been a choice, a shield against pain, but it had also been a barrier to connection. Now, in the warmth of his cabin, surrounded by those who trusted him, he felt the first real stirrings of openness since his self-imposed isolation began. As he watched the firelight flicker across the walls, Jack understood that trust was not instantaneous. It was earned, nurtured, and fragile. Yet it was also powerful, capable of transforming even the most isolated of lives. The women's stories, their courage, and their vulnerability had reached him in ways he had not expected. They had not only sought shelter, they had awakened a part of him that had been dormant for a decade. And in that awakening, Jack realized that human connection, approached with care and respect, was not a threat to his independence, but a complement to it. Before sleep overtook him, Jack stepped to the cabin door and looked out into the forest. The mist clung to the trees, and the distant sounds of wildlife echoed softly. He felt a sense of gratitude for the safety of his home, for the resilience of the women, and for the unexpected ways life could bring people together. Drowned in desperation, he understood that tomorrow would bring new challenges, that the forest was still unpredictable, and that the women's presence would require continued patience and vigilance. But for the first time in many years, he also felt a quiet excitement for what was to come, a recognition that even in a life built on solitude, meaningful connection was possible. As he returned to his bed, Jack reflected on the lessons of the day, the importance of listening,
the power of empathy, and the delicate balance of trust. He knew that he had opened a door that could not easily be closed, and he was prepared to meet whatever came through it with patience and care. The women's surrender to his cabin had not been a surrender of weakness, but a recognition of safety and respect, and he honored that trust with every action he took. Jack drifted into sleep, the fire's warmth on his back, the soft breathing of the women around him, and the forest's gentle night chorus outside. For the first time in a decade, he felt a connection to others, not physical, not invasive, but deeply human and profoundly moving. The events of the day had shifted something inside him, a subtle yet unmistakable change that would shape the days to come. And in the quiet of the night, Jack knew that the story of his life in isolation was no longer solely his own. The days after the storm settled into a quiet rhythm, but the forest remained unpredictable. Jack woke early as usual, tending to his cabin and checking his traps, while the three women moved around carefully, slowly adjusting to the routines of wilderness life. They had become comfortable in his presence, but Jack remained watchful. 10 years of living alone had made him cautious, and though he had begun to trust them, he knew that the outside world could intrude at any moment. This balance of trust and vigilance had become a daily part of their coexistence. On the third day, Jack noticed something unusual while checking the perimeter of his small clearing. There were footprints in the mud, recent human footprints. They were not familiar, and they led from the forest toward his cabin. His heart tightened. The women, still unpacking some of their sparse belongings, were oblivious to the sign of danger. Jack understood immediately that he had to act carefully. He could not alarm them necessarily, but he also could not ignore the potential threat. The forest could be treacherous, and not everyone who wandered through it had kind intentions. He returned to the cabin, quietly gathering the women together without revealing the full extent of what he had seen. "We may have visitors soon," he said carefully, his voice calm but steady. "It's best to stay inside and be ready." The women's expressions shifted from relaxed curiosity to alert attention. They trusted him, but the tension in the air was palpable. Jack moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the cabin for a possible confrontation while maintaining a sense of calm. His experience in the wilderness had taught him that panic could be as dangerous as the threat itself. As night approached, the sound of footsteps grew clearer outside. Jack instructed the women to stay close to the fire and out of sight, and he quietly positioned himself near the doorway, ready to assess the situation. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath. Every sound amplified: the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird. Jack's senses, honed by years of solitude, became his guide. He could feel the tension building, the kind that comes from knowing danger is near but not fully understanding its nature. The first visitor appeared at the edge of the clearing, a lone man, weary and cautious, moving through the shadows. Jack observed him carefully, noting his posture and expressions. He did not immediately appear threatening, but in the forest, appearances could be deceiving. The man seemed lost, perhaps following the trail of the women, or simply wandering in search of shelter. Jack made a split-second decision to confront him verbally before allowing him closer. "Psst. Who's there?" Jack called, his voice firm, echoing slightly in the night air. The man froze, then raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Burse. I mean no harm," he said. "I'm just looking for shelter from the storm." Jack assessed him carefully. There was truth in his voice, but also uncertainty. Jack's instinct told him to remain cautious while offering minimal guidance. "Stay where you are," he said. "I'll decide if it's safe for you to come closer." While Jack managed the situation outside, the women huddled near the fire inside the cabin. Their eyes were wide, their hands clasped together, a mixture of fear and trust directed at the man who had sheltered them.
Press. Jack's presence reassured them. They did not need to know all the details. His calmness was enough. Breath. Slowly, they began to understand that the forest, while unpredictable, could be navigated safely with the right guide.
Jack spoke with the man through the doorway, asking questions to determine his intentions.
He learned that the man had lost his way while traveling through the forest and was seeking temporary shelter until the storm passed completely. Jack could see the honesty in his eyes and, after a tense moment of judgment, allowed him to approach, carefully observing his movements. The man entered the clearing, visibly relieved, and Jack watched closely as he respected the boundaries set by the cabin and the women within. Inside, Jack noticed the women relax slightly, their breathing slowing as they realized that the immediate threat had passed. The storm outside was now a distant memory, but the experience had reinforced a subtle truth. Danger could appear at any time, and trust had to be measured and earned.
Jack explained quietly to the women that not everyone in the forest meant harm, but caution was always necessary.
They nodded, absorbing the lesson silently, understanding the importance of vigilance even in moments of safety. As night deepened, the group shared a simple meal together. Jack offered portions of cooked fish and warm tea, careful to maintain respect for the women's comfort while ensuring that the man, a stranger to both Jack and them, was treated fairly. Conversation flowed cautiously at first, but slowly. The man began to share fragments of his own journey, how he had become lost, his reliance on nature to survive, and the small victories that had kept him moving forward. The women listened politely, occasionally asking gentle questions. Jack observed everything, noting the interactions and the gradual easing of tension in the room. The night stretched on, and Jack remained alert while the fire crackled in the hearth. He reflected on the lessons of the past few days, the storm that had brought the women to his cabin, the subtle bonds of trust that had formed, and the need to balance caution with compassion. He realized that survival in the forest was not just about skill and knowledge, but also about understanding people, reading their intentions, assessing trustworthiness, and acting decisively when necessary. In the quiet hours, the three women began to share more personal stories, their voices hushed, but filled with emotion. They spoke of family left behind, challenges faced on their journey, and the moments of courage that had carried them this far. Jack listened carefully, offering small nods of understanding or gentle words of encouragement when appropriate. He sensed that their trust in him was growing, and he felt a corresponding shift within himself, a willingness to protect and guide them without expecting anything in return. The storm, the stranger, and the shared stories had created an unspoken bond among them. Jack understood that he was no longer just a solitary man living in the forest. He was now a protector, a guide, and a witness to the lives of these women who had surrendered to his care. He felt the weight of responsibility, but also the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he could provide safety and comfort even after 10 years of isolation. As the night wore on, Jack helped the women prepare for sleep. He ensured that blankets were spread, that the fire burned safely, and that the man had a place to rest without intruding on the women's space. He watched over them, mindful of every sound and movement in the cabin, aware that the forest outside remained unpredictable. Yet despite the potential dangers, there was a sense of calm in the shared presence, a quiet acknowledgement that they were not alone, that they were connected through circumstance, trust, and mutual respect. By the time dawn approached, Jack felt a subtle transformation within himself. The events of the past days, the storm, the arrival of the women, and the unexpected encounter with a stranger had challenged the rigid boundaries he had maintained for 10 years. He realized that protecting others did not weaken him. It reinforced the skills, patience, and empathy he had cultivated during his years in solitude. He had discovered a new layer of strength, one that came not from isolation, but from carefully chosen connection. The women, now more relaxed, began to help with the morning routines. They prepared simple meals, tidied the cabin, and assisted Jack with small tasks. Their presence brought a rhythm to the day that Jack had long avoided.
yet he found it comforting. There was a silent acknowledgement between them that each respected the other's space, abilities, and boundaries.
This mutual understanding created a foundation for deeper trust and connection, one that would be tested in the days to come. As they stepped outside into the fresh morning air, Jack observed the forest with a renewed sense of awareness. Brask. He noted the signs of wildlife, the subtle changes in the terrain, and the paths that could provide safety or danger. He shared his knowledge with the women, teaching them small skills that could help them navigate the wilderness more confidently. They absorbed his guidance eagerly, asking questions and practicing under his watchful eye. This teaching, subtle yet meaningful, further strengthened the bonds among them, blending trust, respect, and shared experience into a growing sense of unity. By mid-morning, Jack allowed himself a quiet moment to reflect. 10 years of solitude had taught him patience, resilience, and self-reliance. Yet the presence of the women had revealed another dimension of life: connection, empathy, and the shared courage required to face uncertainty. He understood that while solitude had its place, life's unexpected encounters could enrich it in ways he had not imagined. The lessons of trust, protection, and compassion were not threats to his independence, but extensions of the strengths he had honed in isolation.
As the day progressed, Jack, the 3 women, and the man worked together to repair minor damage from the storm and gather firewood for the coming nights. Each task was performed with care, respect, and subtle cooperation.
The women demonstrated their resourcefulness, contributing ideas and solutions that complemented Jack's expertise. The man, now more comfortable, assisted willingly, his presence lessening the burden on Jack and creating a sense of teamwork that had been absent for a decade. By evening, the cabin was secure, the fire burning steadily, and a quiet sense of accomplishment filled the space. The storm was a memory, but its lessons lingered: resilience, adaptability, and the necessity of trust. Breaths. Jack recognized that the events of these past days had tested him in ways he had not anticipated, challenging his carefully constructed solitude while revealing the strength that could come from human connection. As night fell, Jack prepared for the final vigil before sleep. He tended the fire, checked the perimeter, and ensured that everyone was comfortable and safe. The women rested nearby, the man settled into his spot, and the cabin became a sanctuary once more. Jack allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, acknowledging the transformation that had taken place. He had confronted danger, nurtured trust, and discovered that the walls he had built around his life could be adjusted without compromising his independence or safety. The forest was calm as the sun rose, spilling golden light across the treetops and glimmering on the stream near Jack's cabin. The events of the past week had left their mark on everyone in the small clearing. Jack, who had once lived in complete solitude for 10 years, now felt the warmth of shared experience, the subtle joy of connection, and the quiet satisfaction of trust earned. The 3 women, too, had grown stronger in his presence, having found both shelter and guidance in the cabin that had once been the domain of a solitary man. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with the soft sounds of the forest outside mixing with the crackle of the fire inside. Jack prepared food with his usual care, watching the women as they ate. He could see the light returning to their eyes, the color back in their cheeks, and the relaxed posture that comes when danger has passed and safety is near. The air was filled with a gentle rhythm of movement and conversation, punctuated by laughter over small observations of forest life. For the first time in years, Jack felt fully present, not just a watcher of the wilderness, but part of a shared human story. After breakfast, the conversation turned naturally to the next steps. The women needed to continue their journey to return to family and community, and Jack understood that. Yet there was no sadness in the moment, only a quiet acknowledgement of the bonds they had formed and the lessons learned together. The eldest of the women spoke first, her voice calm and reflective. Breath. She thanked Jack for his kindness, his protection, and the wisdom he had shared. There was no hesitation in her gratitude. It was clear, heartfelt, and genuine. Breath. Jack felt a warmth in his chest he had not known in a decade. The second woman, more expressive and energetic, smiled and spoke of how much she had learned from Jack, not just about survival, but about patience, trust, and self-confidence. She laughed softly as she recounted small mistakes she had made while adjusting to the wilderness, and Jack allowed himself a small smile in return. For the first time in years, the sound of shared laughter felt natural, comforting, and right. It was a reminder that connection, even brief, could bring joy and strength in ways solitude never could. The quietest woman, who had observed the cabin and its routines with such careful attention, spoke last. Her words were thoughtful, deliberate, and filled with appreciation. She acknowledged Jack's patience, his careful balance of distance and care, and the respect he had shown for their dignity and autonomy. Her words moved Jack deeply. He realized that the connection they shared was not based on dependence or need. It was based on mutual respect, understanding, and the courage to trust even after hardship. As the morning progressed, they began packing their few belongings. Jack assisted where needed, helping to organize supplies and ensuring that everyone was comfortable. The cabin, once a space of pure solitude, had become a temporary home of shared experiences, warmth, and life lessons. Each item packed, each careful gesture, was a reminder of the journey they had taken together, not just through the forest, but through the emotional terrain of trust and human connection. Before they departed, Jack led them to the edge of the clearing where the forest opened into a wider path. He pointed out landmarks, safe routes, and areas to avoid, sharing his knowledge carefully and clearly. The woman listened attentively, absorbing every word. It was a teaching moment, but it was also a farewell in its own quiet way. Jack could see the determination and confidence returning to their eyes. The same courage and resilience that had first brought them to his cabin was now paired with the assurance that they could continue safely on their own. The moment of farewell arrived quietly. One by one, the women approached Jack, offering small tokens of gratitude. A touch on the hand, a shared smile, a look that spoke volumes. Jack accepted each gesture with quiet humility, realizing that he had not only offered them shelter, but had also allowed himself to be part of a human connection he had thought he no longer needed. In their eyes, he saw trust, respect, and a shared understanding that transcended words. As they stepped onto the path leading away from the cabin, Jack watched them carefully. He noted the way they moved confidently, the way they helped each other navigate small obstacles, and the subtle sense of independence they carried. He felt a mixture of pride, relief, and quiet joy. 10 years of solitude had taught him to be self-reliant, cautious, and patient, but these few days had reminded him that life's greatest lessons often come from connection, compassion, and shared courage. Desk. Jack turned back toward his cabin, feeling the familiar weight of the wilderness around him. Yet he felt different, lighter, more open, and quietly enriched by the experience. He realized that his solitude, once a shield, could coexist with meaningful connection. Life was not a matter of choosing between isolation and companionship. It was about balance, respect, and the courage to open oneself, even cautiously, to the possibilities of trust. The forest, once merely a backdrop to his solitary existence, now felt alive with potential. The trees, streams, and animals that had been his companions for a decade seemed to hum with a quiet approval, as if acknowledging the growth, courage, and transformation that had taken place. Jack could see that the cabin, his sanctuary, was more than a shelter. It was a place where life could intersect with others safely, compassionately, and meaningfully. As the day wore on, Jack returned to his routines with renewed purpose. He checked his traps, tended his garden, and repaired small parts of the cabin. But the rhythm of his work had changed subtly. There was now a sense of anticipation, a recognition that the world beyond his solitude could bring unexpected moments of connection, challenge, and growth. He felt ready for the unknown, confident that he could navigate it with patience, wisdom, and respect for himself and others. In the quiet of the evening, Jack sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the past week. The storm, the arrival of the women, the shared stories, and the brief crisis with the stranger. All had combined to challenge and reshape him. He understood now that trust, once given carefully, could lead to profound growth. He realized that the walls he had built around his heart were not prisons. They were choices, and choices could be adjusted when life demanded. For the first time in a decade, he felt that opening his life to others, even briefly, had strengthened him rather than weakened him. As night fell over the forest, Jack allowed himself to feel a sense of peace unlike any he had known before. The fire crackled softly. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant sound of the stream provided a gentle rhythm to the evening. Bare. He felt connected to the forest, to the world, and in a small but meaningful way, to the people he had welcomed into his cabin. He understood that life's richest experiences often come from the unexpected, the unpredictable, and the courage to embrace what comes, even when it challenges long-held beliefs or comfort zones. Jack went to bed that night with a quiet heart, the fire's warmth at his back, and the knowledge that life, even after years of isolation, could be full of meaningful encounters, trust, and growth. He had learned that solitude was valuable, but human connection approached with care and respect was equally powerful.
He had discovered that surrendering, not in weakness but in trust, could open the door to transformation.
Breath, and he knew, deep in his heart, that the events of the past week would remain with him forever, not as a disruption to his life, but as a lasting lesson in courage, empathy, and the profound strength of trust. The following morning, Jack stepped outside, the sunrise painting the forest in hues of gold and green. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool, fresh air fill his lungs. The world was the same, yet somehow different, richer, more alive, and filled with possibilities. He looked toward the path where the women had gone, knowing that they were safe and capable, carrying the lessons and kindness he had shared. And he understood that life, even in solitude, could be a story of connection, courage, and quiet transformation, waiting for those willing to open their hearts. Jack returned to his cabin, ready to face the days ahead. His solitude was no longer a shield, but a foundation upon which trust, compassion, and connection could flourish. Disgrace. He knew that life would continue to bring unexpected events, challenges, and encounters, but he felt prepared, grounded, and enriched by the experiences that had unfolded within these past days. He had learned that even after 10 years of living alone, the human heart could still grow, open, and embrace the possibilities of life and connection.